should speak from the podium, begin by stating your name, limit remarks to less than 3 minutes. Committee members may request that discussed items be placed on a future agenda. The committee takes public comment on all regular agenda items during the discussion of those items. So the consent agenda will consider approving the October 2018 Shelter Advisory Committee regular meeting minutes. Everybody had a chance to review those? Yes. Motion?
Motion to approve. Second.
Got a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. Moving on to the regular agenda. Consider election of chairperson, the term ending January 2020.
So one item of note is that we've traditionally had a chairperson and a vice chairperson, but our city ordinance does not allow for a vice chairperson. So the term for those offices is up this month, and so the new city ordinance, which we'll talk about in more detail later, does mandate that our first meeting of a calendar year shall be our election for our offices, and the city ordinance states that our offices are a chairperson only, for some clarification. Now, in the event of an absence, I would defer to our city attorney on how we handle that, but so that's what's before you today, is an opportunity to appoint or to elect a chairperson.
I nominate Ryan for another term.
I agree.
Anyone else interested? By default, I will be the chairperson again.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Moving on to the next agenda item, discussion and possible action related to the calculation of the live release rate.
Thank y'all. So I wanted to spend just a moment today discussing our live release rate. Okay. So when I stepped into this role, we walked through how the live release rate was calculated. It's not something I could back into on my own. And so I figured out and discussed with existing staff that this is how it was being calculated. I would recommend a change at this time. 1, to bring us in line with best practices. 2, so we can be more comparable to other organizations also reporting a live release rate. And 3, to avoid what I would call errors in the calculation. And to kind of talk about what that includes is our generally accepted calculation that we've been doing locally is that we would take the number of euthanasias for the month, would divide that by total residents in the shelter plus new arrivals, okay? That would be the not live release rate. So then 100% minus that number would be our live release rate. And I threw example numbers in there to try to show you what that meant, right? So if a month included 225 euthanasias and we had 367 animals on the property and 505 were new arrivals, that's a sample month that I used, that meant that yielded a number that was 25% didn't release live, so 74.2% did release live, okay? So we were reporting a live release rate of 72.4%. But I would recommend that we change our practices to use the ASPCA recommended live release rate. 1, I like to use an industry standard when we can. 2, I'll walk you through it. I think it inherently makes a little more sense, okay? So the ASPCA recommends that you take the number of pets adopted or transferred out to rescue, plus, so those were released live, right? They left our building alive. Plus any owner redemptions, out the front door, and any wildlife releases. So these are animals that left our custody alive, and then you would divide that by the total outcomes for the month, right? So, and I apologize, my PowerPoint's gotten a little out of order, so let's see if I can maneuver this. Okay, so That same month that we just went through, we had 155 animals that were adopted and or transferred out, 75 that were either owner redeemed or released to the wild, and total outcomes for the whole month were 455. Well, if 230 animals left alive and 455 animals left, that's about half, right? So that makes more sense when you talk through it. So we would say the live release rate for that same month was actually 50.55%, not 74%. So I've taken the liberty of preparing our monthly reports that we're about to go over according to this rate in anticipation that y'all would agree that this makes a lot of sense, that take your live releases divided by your total releases. That's a good live release rate. And I did include in your background a lot of narrative from the ASPCA, which speaks to why that's really good, what all they included when they consider something like this, so that was in your background for greater detail, and we can delve into that. But if it's as simple as making a standard that locally we're going to use the industry standard, that's something I wanted to have for your consideration today.
Well, the original way you showed it doesn't make sense because you're counting dogs as live that haven't gone anywhere yet.
Yes, sir.
Or
That's a
not
good point.
dogs, animals, as one way or the other. They could wind up euthanized, or they could wind up being adopted. So you really can't count those dogs as to a rate you have. This method makes more sense. How many dogs got adopted or got released in other ways live versus how many you actually euthanized, to me, makes the only way to do it correctly.
Anybody else?
My only question is, when we change the calculation process, should we expect to have some sort of knee-jerk response to this where we drop all of a sudden, for example, from 75% to 50%, and people will not understand how to interpret those numbers and think all of a sudden we're killing a lot more animals?
Yes, I have struggled with how to communicate to the public that a 50% live release rate is still good, even though we used to call it a 74% live release rate. And so not only do we discuss it at this level, but my monthly report goes before management. And in that narrative, I do have like a disclaimer at the bottom, according to a new live release rate. I am working through the old data to show a side-by-side comparison of, we were really bragging on ourselves that we had a 74% live release rate. Those months were hard earned. We hustled, we made things happen, we moved a lot of animals out. We were rewarded by, oh, it's a 74% live release rate. When you find out we really hustled and it was a 50% live release rate. So we'd have to have a new normal to be able to say, before I was not pleased with a 50% live release rate. That doesn't feel good to me. That leaves a lot of room for improvement. But intrinsically, we know we do have a lot of room for improvement. We do have more opportunities for live releases that we just don't have the resources to apply to yet. And so it's more accurate, but there does need to be some kind of communication plan to speak to, this used to be 74%, is how we used to communicate this. And I do struggle with how to pivot that mindset in the public, because I don't get much feedback from the public saying, oh, good, you had a 74% live release rate, or how on earth did you, I will say, internally, as we were having these discussions, I had some staff members say, I was wondering why you were reporting a 74% live release rate when we released 230 animals out of 450. And I said, yes, it's been a puzzle, for sure, and probably something that we should have taken action on sooner. But so I think in some ways there will be folks that say, Oh, good. That makes a lot more sense. We were reading your monthly reports and not understanding why that was being reported. And in some folks, people will say, y'all were averaging a 70% live release rate. Now you're only averaging a 50% live release rate. So for one, the annual report, well, we need to update some information and get it out to the public.
Your total outcomes is also the number euthanized.
Right, so total outcomes would be anything that left the building dead or alive.
I think just helping
Somewhere,
people
you're going to have
understand
to
that-
show, in order to explain it, you're going to have to show the pending group. How many dogs do you have here that haven't gone either way yet?
Right, and that is something we report in our monthly report is animals left
Yeah.
in the shelter at month end.
Yeah.
That for the live release rate, they do not care about how many animals came in during the month. They do not care about how many animals are left in your facility at the end of the month. They care about how many animals are live released. It's the live release rate. So we still report in the monthly report, and we'll get to that in our next one. We still report how many animals arrived, how many animals are still left in the building.
I think helping people understand that the old way of calculating it included animals that didn't leave the shelter.
Right, not
Is-
live released, not
yeah.
released alive, but not released.
Right. I think people need to understand that the calculations were skewed because those animals were included in that number, so.
And we did an annual report at our last meeting where I talked about our fiscal year end and our numbers, and that might be a valuable document to share on our website, to share through our public information office with this revised calculation and say, this is our report card, this is our performance for the year of how we did. And so the monthly reports could be updated and corrected and republished, although they're not published to the public in that way except at this venue. But the annual report, I think, is where it's at. That is, if I were a citizen and I wanted to become more informed on what was happening in our community, I would read the annual report. And so I think that with y'all's blessing with this new live release rate, we'll go back and update that annual report and publish it.
Explain to people that we're giving them a truer number. The best way to do it.
And I don't think we should focus so much on what the live release rate is, because being in the shelter every day and knowing what's happening and there's a lot of work going on to get these animals out alive. But that live release rate is affected by a couple of things, your wildlife, but it's also affected by your feral cat euthanasia. And so I think that, it's good to know what the live release rate is, but I think that all of the information needs presented in the whole breakdown needs to be presented in some form so people can see that, euthanasia is declining while their, adoption's holding steady, but owner redemptions are going up. I mean, there's a lot of work being done. The owner redemptions has really been impressive to see that, that increase, and the adoptions and the transfers. So there's a lot of work going on that I don't think is, really reflected if you just go out and say, the shelter has a 50% live release rate, because what that means is, they're killing the other 50%. When people are relating that euthanasia to a cute fluffy puppy, when that's not the case, it's sick ferals coming in or
Injured
so.
wildlife.
I think it's important that we don't get stuck on what the live release rate is, even though I know that that's how the no-kill initiative is defined. We still have a good, strong no-kill initiative because of the adoptable pets that are in the shelter. They're being treated medically, they're being worked with, they're being rehabbed, they're being rehomed. So there's a lot of positive going on that I just don't want us to get so stuck on that number that we don't see that.
It's one data point in 5,000 animals that arrived. It's one of our things to report. It's not our comprehensive grade on our report card.
Everybody's in agreement, we adopt the ASPCA calculation guidelines? Okay. So moving forward, we'll use the new calculations and just, when it comes up, explain to people why we've done that. All right, so now we'll move on to discussion of possible action related to monthly shelter numbers for October 2018.
am worried that this is no longer, that my whole presentation didn't get loaded. Oh, good. Oh, it's just out of order. Okay. Okay. So for October 2018, we had 407 new arrivals. That was about 100 less than the month before. So October through about January is kind of our slower time for arrivals, and we did see that for October. That's the first month that we saw that downward tick. We did have 114 adopted and rescue transferred. That is a little below average, but still well within a normal rate. 53 pets were redeemed by owner. That's about average, what we've been doing. 249 pets were euthanized, and we will work through that detail in just a moment. 56 were microchipped, so that's a little above average. Good news to report there. And you'll recall that late last year, we adopted a policy that, microchip is required if you reside in city limits. So if you're redeeming your pet, along with the fees that go with that redemption, we just go ahead and add that $13 microchip fee at that time. If you then opt to not microchip, you are subject to a citation because you're already found to be in violation. So I do like to see that we microchipped 56 when 53 were owner redeemed. It looks like that system's working. So a large number still left in the shelter of 358 animals, and so this was a particularly tough month with that many euthanasias. So under our new calculation, that was a 38% live release rate. Okay. One other way to break that down is of the 249 animals that were euthanized, 189 were cats, 49 were dogs, 11 were wildlife. That included 1 armadillo, 1 bat, and 9 skunks. Another way to break down that euthanasia, there were 115 that were sick, injured, or failure to thrive. The largest culprit there for considering for euthanasia were our failure to thrive. We still saw a large number of cats coming in that were too young to be away from their mother, getting sick before they were weaned, which is difficult that we're so far out from kitten season in October 2018, and still our largest culprit for euthanasia is those failure to thrive. And we are working on a lot of interesting things going into the 2019 kitten season that I hope to be able to report successes on in the future. So 76 cats were 76 were euthanized because they were feral. 46 were euthanized because they were either aggressive or coming out of bite quarantine. 9 were euthanized because they were wildlife, and 3 were euthanized because they were requested by their owner. So that is your October.
I wanted to make just a real quick comment on the euthanasia for the sick and failure to thrive. We kind of have a policy in place with our partnership with PAWS in the city that if it is a tame, adoptable animal that is sick, we're doing everything we can to treat. But in cats, and you'll see that cats is the big number on the screen, there are some diseases that we can not test for, and one is feline infectious peritonitis, FIP. And so we'll get symptoms that are comparable to upper respiratory. We'll treat, but the minute that we've taken them off the steroids and off the antibiotics, they're sick again. And so that is a chronic illness that there's no treatment for that will eventually be terminal for them. And so that makes a big number of those sick cats. It's not that we're not treating, it's things that we treat, but the minute they're off the medication, they relapse because it is a chronic condition, and that makes them not adoptable.
And that's a good point to bring up, that I feel like our staff and our PAWS partners have gotten a lot smarter about identifying illness. In shelter cats, shelter medicine is just a different bird. It's a different situation. And so we are testing for FIV and FELUC, which are also terminal. And so we would be able to say, we were going to treat this animal, but now we know it has a terminal illness. So we would choose to be humane at that point for the safety of the rest of our population. And because now we know, hey, we're not just treating upper respiratory infection here. We're not just treating something pretty innocuous. It's something that is contagious and something that is terminal. And so FIP is the one outlying thing that there is no test for. It is kind of a matter of deduction. Like they don't have this, they don't have this, they don't have this, and they have these symptoms after treatment. It must be FIP. And it is something that perhaps it was October, that we saw a tremendous number of animals coming in, testing negative for everything, but super sick cats. And so when we have this cross-section of animals coming in, it's indicative of illness going on in the community. And so we do think that there is a strain of something particularly nasty going through our cats who live outdoors, our community cats, that they are cross-contaminating themselves, and it is autoimmune and it is terminal. So, but we've gotten a lot smarter about when do we treat and deploying a lot of resources for treatment, but can we identify those terminal things early on so we can use resources instead for those that can recover? Is that a fair statement, Jenny?
Is there anything that pet owners can do with domesticated cats to prevent FIP?
Well, vaccinations will prevent so much of this. And there are a lot of, and I'm not a vet, so I need to definitely preface that. I wish Dr. Schulte was here to speak to it. But from my understanding, what I've been told, there are a lot of domesticated pets that may have FIP, but they won't break with symptoms because they're never stressed, or they're living an otherwise healthy environment as a house cat. So, but when you have them turned loose in the community or they're brought into a shelter environment, then that disease shows its ugly face.
Have any questions about October? Nope. All right, we'll move on to November.
Okay, so for November, we maintained our new arrivals at about 414 animals. 154 were adopted or transferred out. That's on average with what we've been doing for adoptions. But going into November and December, I think it's important to note that those are usually slow months for adoptions, and so it's good that we were still able to maintain these averages. We had a low month for owner redemptions with 36 pets redeemed. 226 animals were euthanized, so still a large number there. 38 animals were microchipped, and 348 were still left in the shelter, with a live release rate of 44.5%. And as a frame of reference, under our old calculation, we would have reported that as a 70% live release rate. So that's part of what you'll see there with our new normal. So of those pets that were euthanized, of course, we see cats that are high on the list of 154, 49 dogs, 23 wildlife, which included 2 deer, 1 fox, 1 raccoon, and 19 skunk. Foxes we generally do not deal with a lot. They are high risk for rabies, but they do not come close to people. We generally don't catch them. They are pretty elusive wildlife. We did start to see in November some unique cases with foxes that we did not know what to think of them. And what I mean by that is a fox hanging out on someone's carport, just on the roof of their carport, dogs barking at it, fox is not running away, highly residential area, very crowded area, and that fox is just living its best life in the sun, and that's not the normal demeanor for a fox. So our first concern in that situation is rabies. That when you've contracted rabies, one of the early signs is a 100% change in temperament. So a wild thing will become docile. A domesticated pet will become aggressive because the disease wants to live. And so we encourage that pet owner to let us on the property to try to trap that fox and bring it in. So we did have the opportunity to test this fox that was brought in. It was negative for rabies, and we've since tested several, and they continue to be negative for rabies. When I talk to my folks at the state lab and the veterinarians, they say canine distemper will also do that, that foxes are subject to canine distemper, and it will change their temperament as well. And so you'll see a fox, or even we had a sighting for a coyote in an elementary school local playground in this time frame. And so anything that's out there that's a wild canine can also catch that same distemper that our domesticated dogs can. So we do think that that's what we're seeing, but we are being diligent and testing when we have those opportunities because we want to make sure it doesn't escalate to something else. We do know that our friends to the west, Midland, Odessa, did have a lot of distemper recently, and so it is something that, you know, vaccinations for your own domestic canines is a terrific way to prevent that, but that's our hypothesis, and we are continuing to watch it closely.
The skunks, it seems to be a large number of skunks lately.
Yeah, skunks are on the move. You know, skunks, their temperament is that they're very shy. They're very scared of people, and so they generally will stay away. So we're going into also our skunk season. You know, late January, we'll start to see. So in the fall and into the winter months, you'll see a lot more movement in skunks. Because of that, you'll see a lot more rabies in skunks. You'll recall last year we had 3 rabid skunks in Tom Green County that we reported to y'all, which is high for us, you know. And so as those animals are moving more, we're trapping more, and then they get exposed to rabies more. And so I think going into 2019, we may see even more rabid skunks than usual, just because it's their season to be moving.
So the wildlife that you're euthanizing is wildlife that can't be released back into the wild?
Yes, so we would consider, of course, releasing wildlife that's trapped or caught in some way, you know, if there's a raccoon on someone's front porch, if they're healthy, if they're not injured. For skunks, we have a difficulty releasing them because they spray and we can't handle them. And so skunks, we unfortunately do not consider releasing to the wild. So if we have a skunk in a trap, every one of those are euthanized. Partly because we see so much rabies in skunks and no other animals, and partly because it's a hazard to my staff to be able to safely move them without getting sprayed or whatever. Okay,
Go ahead, no.
Another way to break down that euthanasia, of course, is 62 sick, injured, or failure to thrive, 102 feral cats, 36 were either aggressive or by quarantine, 22 wildlife, that's the skunks you saw on the prior page, 4 were owner requested. So that is your November.
Any questions? Nope. Okay, December?
Okay, so December, we got a break. 291 new arrivals. That's about a 30% decrease to the prior month, which was already a low month, right? So we had 155 adoptions and rescue transfers. That's excellent for the season that we were going into. 75 of those adoptions were specifically at the Home for the Holidays adoption event, which I really have to brag on our successes there with our partner, Concho Valley Paws. The 49 were redeemed by owner, and although that is below average, we worked that helpmegetHome.com local lost and found website. We hustled to get these pets out of there. Because of the holidays and going on into January, we had a tremendous number of phone calls and postings on Help Me Get Home about lost pets that never came in the shelter. And so when we get those phone calls, we're encouraging folks, as soon as you find your pet, go ahead and bring it in to be microchipped, because of course none of them are in covering the front desk and answering those phone calls. When someone calls in and says, "Do you have my pet?" 99 times out of 100, they are not microchipped. And so we're encouraging that opportunity. I know you don't have your pet right now. We're hopeful that you get reunited with your pet. As soon as you do, please bring it in for microchip. We do it for $13. And folks are surprised. They're surprised it's the law. They're surprised it's so affordable. And so we're trying to do that. So for 49 redemptions for December, that looks low. I know a ton of people were looking for their pets. They just weren't coming through the shelter. But we were able to reunite those 49. So only 18 went through the microchip clinic, and then 335 left in the shelter, so some much-needed relief there with a reduction in our population. So, y'all, 65% live release rate on this new calculation. I went back to 2016. That's our highest release ever. I think that that's important to note. I think that that's how you measure our success. And we say that so part of it is we euthanize very few animals, less than half what we euthanized the month before. And that is because we're treating so much. And so that is really something to brag on, what we're doing out there. And of those euthanized, 73 were cats, only 19 dogs euthanized. So a tremendous effort there. And then 9 wildlife. And of the 101 euthanized, 35 sick, injured, failure to thrive, 35 feral, 23 were aggressive or bite quarantine, 6 wildlife, and 6 owner requested. So a really good December, and my staff felt it. I mean, they came to me and reported and said that they could tell that we had a lot of happy endings, a lot of good stories to be able to report anecdotally of pets that needed to get out of there, either owner redemptions as well as adoptions. We got some media coverage for some of that, and one donation because someone was so impressed with what we were doing. So we put that towards our spay-neuter to be able to reinvest in what we're doing out there.
So we had any transports the last quarter?
December, we only had the 1 transport because of the holidays, and we've got 2 pending this month already. One leaves on Monday, and I'm not real sure when the next one, but it's the following week. So we've got some transports going out, and we need it. We're approaching puppy and kitten season, so we need to move some dogs and cats.
Yeah. Have any questions over the numbers?
Well, I think the fact that we had 65% gives us a new bar to shoot for.
Absolutely.
We have our goal. We need to try and continue to beat that, equal it or beat it, and hopefully we can do that.
Is there an industry standard of what our goal is, or what, they start recognizing as being successful when you get above a certain amount? Or?
Sure. I think a live release rate is defined as a 90% live release rate. And I will say that everything comes with an asterisk. And so there's a footnote on your monthly report to say it's quite common for organizations to report, excluding wildlife, excluding feral cats, excluding aggressive animals, that, if I wanted to report how successful we were, I wouldn't consider those items. I didn't choose to euthanize wildlife because I had more resources that month or worked harder that month. I didn't choose to euthanize feral cats because we have a robust TNRM program. I didn't choose to euthanize an aggressive animal. That's not because of some failure my staff had. And so it's not uncommon that those particular items are struck from the report. And so you may say, oh, well, we do have a 90% live release rate, because if we had, of our 101 euthanasias, 35 were feral, 23 were aggressive. So if we removed those items and said, then that makes your live release rate looks really good. So there is an industry standard that 90% means that you've reached a live release rate. There's not an industry standard of what do you include in that or not. And so there is a movement to say, stop reporting the numbers, just do good work and report your successes of that. And if you have a robust feral cat program, brag on that. If you don't have a robust feral cat program, get one. And so if you don't have training opportunities for aggressive pets, then just report that. And so to answer your question, 90% is considered no kill, but read the small print.
And make up 10%, and that's not anything you can prevent or help. So, yeah, I understand.
And when you look at the industry standard, each one of these facilities is very different. Some of them are municipal shelters with partnerships like what we have. Some of them are ASPCA's that are not open intake. So they're able to kind of control what enters into their shelter, and so they don't take the ferals in, so they don't have the feral count. So it's very widespread. To me, no kill means that if they're adoptable, we're getting them out of there. So I'm real pleased with the progress we've made. I'd like us, and Morgan and I have had these discussions just recently, come up with something for the ferals. Because it is unfortunate, because some of the ferals are healthy, if we had some kind of resources for them where they could live out their life but they're not adoptable because no one's going to take that into their home. Some communities have great success with barn cat programs, but yet, we're doing free adoptions for tame house cats. So we're kind of in a tough spot on the ferals, and I'm hoping we can come up with something. We're putting our heads together. But each one of these facilities that participates in the no-kill movement is so different. So it's really important to compare apples to apples. And some of them don't have bite quarantine. They're not the rabies. The shelter is the rabies quarantine for the county. So that's right, for the
Right.
county. So, they don't have the bite quarantine, and those are not adoptable, because once they leave bite quarantine, if an owner hasn't redeemed them and it's been a human bite, that's not something that we can place in a home.
And there's many organizations out there that specialize, all they deal with are dogs.
Right.
So you don't have feral cats, you don't have these other things, and they report high rates. Well, they're only dealing with dogs.
Right.
A very low occurrence of autoimmune disease, which is our biggest issue with cats, even domestic cats. So
Yeah.
it is difficult and to compare. And so I think the reason I still like to report our live release rate, and I still think it's valuable, is to know our normal. How do we choose to operate? How do we know we had a rough month versus a greatly improved month? That I still think it tells a story, but I am not looking at Midland and Odessa's live release rate. I don't care to compare ourselves to them because they don't have this public-private partnership. I also don't choose to compare ourselves to Austin because they have a
lot of help.
lot of resources.
They have a lot of help.
And so it's more about who we are and how we want our community to look. Are we happy with a 65% live release rate? Today I am, very much so.
And I just want to make one more point. When I started 10 years ago, and I don't think I tell this enough, but that kill rate we were one of the second highest in the state of Texas for the number of animals that we killed, especially considering our size. And the kill rate was 82%. That means 82% of the animals that entered the shelter were being euthanized. And I don't know if you have access to reports that go back that far, but I would venture to say a very large percentage of those were for time and space because of the policies and the practices they had back then. So to see a 65% live release rate is amazing. I mean, it is amazing, and it took a lot of work to get there. So I think, the city and my staff both deserve a lot of kudos for that, because this was hard and fought to get there, and I'm proud of it. I don't like seeing 30% live release rates, but as long as we're seeing that these adoptable animals are getting adopted, I think that we're doing, the right thing. Because when you look at the big picture, there's only so many resources that we have for what we're doing. So I think that I think Morgan said it. We're back there quietly changing the world for these animals. So I'm real pleased to see how far it's come.
I'd like to,
Go
say thank you for all of your hard work, and it shows and it's appreciated from us and from everyone. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and if you can show a year ago what you did, and 5 years back what it was, then you can show a story of how well we are improving by all the hard work you people are doing.
Yes, sir.
And I think keeping the 0 killed for time and space in front of everyone is really important, exactly like that. Yeah, and maybe on a main page, I don't know how we get out this information, but just make sure that it's apparent to the public we're not euthanizing for anything other than we're required to euthanize them.
Yes, sir.
Okay. We will move on to consider adopting committee bylaws.
Okay. So in September 2018, the City Council edited their entire Code of Ordinances in how it manages and regulates the 23 boards and committees that are created by the City Council. So one of the requirements in that was to bring greater uniformity. It spoke a little bit to term limits. Quite frankly, our bylaws were already the same as what they adopted in term limits, but it did state that we had to adopt new bylaws within 6 months of that adoption. And so what I've brought to you today there's no substantive changes. There were some things changed in the ordinance that superseded our own local policy, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it's the same document and governance that we've been using. We simply need to re-adopt it in the new format. For example, it standardized that there will be 2-year terms with 3 term limits. So you can serve for 6 terms. And one of the confusions we've had is we have so much turnover on this board, or we have had in the past, that you may have been appointed to serve someone else's term, right? So you serve for 9 months. And then I call you and say, hey, are you willing to serve another term? No, I was just appointed 9 months ago. And we got a lot of those discussions. And so this would be 3 of your own 2-year terms. If you're serving someone else's unexpired term, that does not count towards your term limit, from what I understand. So that was already in our bylaws, and so we're just adopting that, that's already been mandated by the ordinance as well. One other thing, so I had added some standard language in red. The city attorney also went through and struck a ton of language that was already duplicated in the city ordinance, because that's the hierarching document. And so you saw that in your background, that stuff that was lined through. And so I'll get y'all a clean copy should you choose to approve that today. One of the things that I left in the bylaws, because again, I made no substantive changes, is that it states, so state law requires us to meet 3 times annually. City ordinance restates that and says you must meet 3 times annually. Our local bylaws state that we will meet the 3rd Thursday of each month unless there's no business to discuss. Because we've done a better job, I think, more efficient job of bringing you items that are under your purview for discussion, there are a number of months that we don't meet. And so I think it makes sense to leave the bylaws as is, that we will meet the 3rd Thursday unless no business to discuss. But I do have a future agenda item to kind of set our calendar for 2019. I want to give us the freedom to meet more frequently if we want to. We can meet more frequently than 3 times a month. And so I'd like to hold that 3rd Thursday. So it's kind of just committee preference. We can change the bylaws and say, hey, we'd like to meet quarterly, or we'd like to meet 3 times a year, because that's what's required by state law. I would recommend just leaving it as is and then just dealing with cancellations and setting the calendar in real time. I'd like the bylaws to be a document we don't edit much, but our calendar can be something we edit as needed, if that makes sense.
So you're saying leaving the bylaws that we meet on the 3rd Thursday unless there's no business to discuss, but have a calendar that we're actively participating from that has the meetings quarterly or whatever we decide?
Yes, there's an agenda item and a couple items for those watching at home that during follow-up and administrative, that it's January. Let's go ahead and set our meeting calendar for 2019. Then if we have to call a special meeting, we plan to meet these dates, right? But if we want to also meet an additional date, we still have that 3rd Thursday reserved. We know, hey, we generally see each other on the 3rd Thursday. So, and there's opportunity if we want to discuss changing that at this time.
Yeah, we can call special meetings, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to have 3 meetings a year and call 6 special meetings.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I like this idea of leave it how it is. The 3rd Thursday, unless there's no business, then we don't meet. But then we don't have to call special meetings, and we use them for what they really should be used for.
Do we have it set where the chair it's the chair who determines there's no business?
I think the bylaws state the chair or city liaison, either one.
Okay.
Which is me.
Right.
I mean, you've been good this year about letting us know well ahead of time that there's nothing to discuss, and we just postpone until the next meeting, so.
I hope so. I do think that there's some room for improvement there, so that's why I made the agenda item, like, let's discuss the 2019 calendar and go ahead and say, we're going to meet these days. And we're not going to meet certain months. Because I don't get feedback that it's a problem when we cancel the meetings, but I do think that if there's better opportunity to communicate with the public, we can go ahead and do that. So. The next item I wanted to touch on is we prior had a component in our bylaws which spoke to an attendance standard. The city ordinance adopted their own attendance standard, which is very similar to what we had before, but it instead says that failure to attend 2/3 of meetings in a 1-year rolling period shall be deemed to have automatically resigned. That we have had some trouble in the past with excessive absenteeism, and the old process for that was you take it before the council member who appointed them to remove them. Well, that can create a lot of issues as well. And so instead of making it an extra action item where we have to go and remove somebody, it's just stated that if you fail to attend 2/3 of meetings in a 1-year period, you shall be deemed to have automatically resigned. Now, that's unexcused absences, okay? Then our bylaws define, each committee's bylaws would state, what is an excused absence, and our bylaws say 24 hours notice. So if you're sick and gonna be out, if you're traveling and gonna be out, that as long as you let either the chairperson or the city liaison know that 24 hours in advance of the meeting you are gonna be absent, then that would be counted as an excused absence. It would not trigger this event. This is meant to capture those committee members that are not plugged in, that are not aware of what's going on, to go ahead and speak to that item fresh out. And then the next item I just wanted to bring up, it's something that we have discussed in the past, that the bylaws do require monthly volunteers or visits to the animal shelter, just so that you're well informed on how daily operations are or how things are going out there, so that when we come into this room to make decisions, that we're well informed on the issue. And so it's not uncommon to require something like that, but we've discussed it in the past. And so I wanted it to be before y'all as something we can discuss. There's also this opportunity that if we are changing our meetings to be less frequent for 2019, perhaps that creates room in the schedule for visits at that time. And so the time that we would normally meet could instead be, a shelter visit. We also used to have the meetings at the animal shelter, which kind of, two birds, one stone situation. But for the intention of, sharing our discussions with the public and being recorded, of course, all committee meetings meet here now. So that is also still just in the bylaws as usual. And one thing I want to note is this 6-month deadline to adopt new bylaws. There is opportunity to discuss this at our next meeting if we wanted to have a more in-depth conversation. I think our bylaws are pretty cut and dry. I don't think there's a lot to discuss there, so that's why I did make it available to you as an action item today. But if you're feeling more comfortable either doing more work on it, assigning someone to work directly with me to make edits or reviews or whatever, that there is opportunity for that as well. It's never my intention to bring y'all something and say, you have to make a decision right now. So it is before you as an action item, or we can table it to next meeting.
Have any feedback on the changes that are requested?
I think what was presented here is good. I don't really see a reason to go.
So, are you making a recommendation to remove the volunteer stipulation in the
No,
bylaws?
there's
Leave it in?
recommended, I've not recommended any changes to the bylaws. But I just there are specific items that we have discussed recently, so I just wanted to note,
And
this one's still in, that one has changed, but I think is still in the spirit of what we intended. This one's still in. So I've not made any changes, but I did want to bring to your attention the overarching ordinance, what changes it impacted on us.
I don't know the structure in which the volunteer issue should be addressed within the bylaws, but I really feel that it's important, since this body hears public comment, for the people serving on this committee to have some grasp of what goes on out there, and you don't unless you're out there. I mean, I took vacation time at Christmas and go back out there, and it's just amazing how much can change and what happens. And so I think it's important to have pulse of the shelter. So I don't know what structure, but I do feel that that's an important part of the bylaws that we have in there, that we require something out of the people serving on this committee to come out and see.
And at this time, it's a monthly volunteer visitation, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, would anybody, I know before you know it, the month is over.
Yeah.
If we could maybe change that to a quarterly visit, so we're still doing it and going out there and seeing what they need from us. But, I mean, we all also work full-time jobs as well. Or I do. So that's my suggestion to the committee, but, I mean,
I think that's a good idea. I agree with it. I think either quarterly or bi-monthly meetings, and.
well, I just mean visiting the shelter,
Right.
yes.
And on those days that we're not gonna be having a meeting here, plan to ask people to come out and say, we don't have any business, come on out, see what's going on. I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I would be in agreement with that. I mean, I'd rather have fewer meetings and have more exposure.
Yeah, and y'all can make that in the form of a motion if you want to accept the new bylaws with the change that a volunteer and visitation would be quarterly. That could be something y'all could consider
My
today.
thought is, I mean, I have it on my calendar for the third Thursday of every month.
Right.
So, I mean, I would say on months that we don't meet, we go to the shelter and pay visitation. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be that Thursday, but you need to make sure one day you need to visit the shelter that month.
The only problem I see with that, what if we have a year that we meet every month? Then you didn't have one of those months to go out to the shelter.
Right.
And you could say, instead of monthly visits, you could have 6 times annually, or, I mean, it really is wide open. This is not something that's governed by a higher body, so it's what makes sense to us in this group. So there's a lot of opportunity, and it's not intended to be punitive. The bylaws do say that if you fail to comply with any component, you could be removed from the board for any reason. And so I also don't want to create a situation where we're considering removing somebody from the board who missed, one visit. And so that's not something we've taken any action on. It's not the intention. So there's some freedom there. Do we want it to be something that's achievable, but also something that serves the purpose?
I would move adoption of the presented bylaws with the modification to make it quarterly visitations, and then apart from that, have down as kind of a best practice that we do, but not part of that motion, that we're gonna be meeting any month we don't have business to meet over, we will meet out at the shelter, and that's an opportunity for people to go out there.
Sure.
But not meet at the shelter, but have just people show up as they can.
Right.
Right, okay.
But I would, if it's down on all of our schedules, I would love for us to still maintain that and say, there'll be, Morgan will be here third Thursday, or they're prepared to receive y'all on the third Thursday and kind of show you around and see what's going on.
But do we have to be concerned with quorum?
We do. So, but it's
Be a meeting?
it's doable. It's manageable. And if I know we're going to do that, I just publish a notice of possible quorum. More than 4 members of the ASAC may be at the shelter at this time and date. And so it's not intended to discuss city business, but it is
Educational.
Just
under the
to
Open
be
Meetings
transparent.
Act. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's, the educational component is one of the things that are the exceptions in the Open Meetings Act, right?
right, the communication with the citizenry.
We've got a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. So now we'll have discussion regarding committee membership terms.
I wanted to take this opportunity to talk really quickly. I know I emailed each of you, but just so we have a broader discussion about this, Dr. Davenport Herbst, Jenny Wilson, and Sandra are all on terms that end next January, so 12 months from now. Ryan, Kara, Tom, and Dr. Schultze are in terms that expire in 2019, so this month, and all of you have generously agreed to serve your time again into the new term. One thing I wanted to note is that Jenny is serving a specialized role. We're required to have a animal welfare representative. Sandra is also serving in a specialized role. We're required to have a city or county official. And then Dr. Schultze, of course, is serving in the specialized role that is to have a veterinarian. But one thing that I have noticed and struggled with and tried to work through and has now come to a head is the state law also requires somebody who is a shelter representative. And that's shorthand for the law that says a member of the committee must be someone whose job duties include daily supervision of the operation of the shelter. And I've asked multiple times, who is that? And is it me as a non-voting member sitting in this seat? Is it Jenny because we have our partnership with Paws and she's at the shelter? And I finally got an answer that the answer is no. We are not in compliance, that this requirement of the state law that is also mirrored in the city ordinance and our bylaws is unsatisfied at this time. And so we are required to have someone that actually sits on the committee as a voting member to be what I would in shorthand call a shelter representative. So the state requires these 4 specialized appointments. Then city ordinance grants 3 additional general appointments. So when we look at this list, we are not in compliance with state law. And so the city recommends that one of these general appointments that are expiring this month instead be filled with a shelter representative, and that at their February 2019 meeting, they would consider filling those general terms that are expiring, this specialized term that's expiring, and the specialized seat that we don't currently have. So I don't know what will come of this. I don't know the details of the moving parts, but it's something I've wondered about for a while, and I finally asked the right person who said, oh yes, it's a problem. We need to take action now. So, and that was Teresa as the city attorney. And so I wanted y'all to be aware of it. I didn't know this answer when I emailed all of you and asked, would you like to be reappointed to your term? I do want to be respectful of your time. I do appreciate y'all sitting in these chairs and assisting and supporting. And it's not my intention to obligate you to something and then take it away. It's something that came up that I wanted y'all all to be aware of. And I guess we'll know the rest of the story at our next meeting, but it is something that will go before the council for appointment.
So absolutely, we can't have more than 7 serve?
That was my question.
I asked, could we have an 8th non-voting member? And then it would mostly look like it does right now. I would be perhaps an 8th non-voting member. I would be in this spot. And the answer was no. And I guess legally you could. It would be an ordinance amendment to an ordinance that we just changed in September. And so there's another ordinance that says you cannot take an ordinance back to the council that has been before the council in the last 6 months. So could it change? I guess it could. Does it make sense to change? You know, we have 7 council members, which is why we have 7 seats on this committee, right? That technically we're only required to have 4 committee members. The council said there's 7 of us. Let's have 7 committee members because each of us then get to have representation. So if we instead went to 8 representatives, who would get to put 2 seats? Who would get double representation. You know, I don't perceive that there's a lot of dialogue where your council member who appointed you is calling you saying, I need you to bring these things before the ASAC. I need you to have these opinions at the ASAC. That's not the intent, but to have equal representation, that each council member has one representative to each board and committee, then that's the intent behind having 7 when the state doesn't even require 7.
See, and my thought would be, you would if there's 4 required representatives, and then the 3 additional general appointments, my thought would be you would have 7 general appointments and then the state required representatives. So it makes, it doesn't make sense to me because you're limited on the number of veterinarians that are available and city officials that are available, shelter representatives that are available. So are the council members truly getting representation, or is it just whoever professionally fills those roles because that's what's required?
And I think they face that, I know this stuff, I read these laws, but I think they run into similar issues on in planning and development, that they're required to have a licensed master plumber. They're
Right.
required to have these things. And so it's not unusual that your committees are required to solicit from this professional group, and sometimes those become the positions that are hard to fill because your population that you can grab from is smaller. But I don't know how they handle, well, then we can have 10 members, or we can, it does, I couldn't speak to that. I don't know how the other committees handle that.
Well, I know that there's at least one committee that I know of that has alternates. Could we have an alternate?
Not without waiting 6 months to change the ordinance, and if there was support for that to happen.
My only question, just after looking at the terms you put up, I mean, on the shelter representative most specifically, if we only have, was it 2-3-year terms?
Yes.
I mean, and if you're still in that position, I don't, maybe it won't be an issue, but it just seems like that's.
Who sits in that seat in 6 years?
Yeah.
I hope I still work here. Who do
Yeah.
we? Oh, yeah.
Well, I will say, I was on this committee back when Alvin New was mayor. I was his appointment. The only person that was from the shelter was the person in your position. There was no member of the committee that worked at the shelter otherwise. I've never seen another person on this committee that worked for the shelter other than the one in your position.
Well, and that's not what we're proposing. There would not be 2 shelter representatives on the committee. There would still simply be the one, like what you're used to in the past. We would be reconvening what you used to witness in the past.
Well, you're technically not on the committee for that
Right.
list. So, and that's the position I've always
pa-
seen the shelter person in, the position you have, not as one of these committee members here, one of these 7.
That person may not have been seated at the dais, but they were technically, yes, appointed to the committee. They may have chosen not to vote. They may have not seated at the dais, but they were appointed by the council to serve on the committee.
That was an 8th person.
Well, then it was out of compliance as well. Because this ordinance statement about 3 generals, it has not changed in at least 10 years that I've gone back to. And that was another time we were out of compliance.
How about?
That may have been there, but I'm just telling you what I've seen, and from the time I started getting involved in this committee, back when Alvin New was mayor, from that point on, I have not seen any person from the shelter other than the person in your position right there. And we
It
had
was.
7 members
I
otherwise.
mean, I think that's what it was. It was, you were the liaison, but also, I'm saying when we were there.
Right.
It was at the shelter rep, but also serving as the liaison between.
But then you also had 7 committee members?
But then we had 8 people. If you counted her as one of the committee, then that was an 8th person, because we had 7 members here.
Well, the thing is,
Well
we're not
as-
trying to
as
come
your
into
position.
compliance with what they're saying is is how we need to properly seat people, so.
The regulation's not new. We have just identified that we need to take action now to become compliant.
Well, that's not even us that can take action. That's the council has to take action on this. And so I would recommend that we refer this back to the council with our recommendation that once they're able to take the matter up again after the 6 months has expired, that they appoint the head of the shelter for the city to serve as an 8th member of this committee ex officio. And that way, whoever is in that position at that time, and that they be exempted from term limitations. Because it would be a special 8th seat that would be simply by virtue of being in the position you hold right now, that sits you on the committee.
Sure. And I've made note of that to bring up. Mhm.
That's my recommendation.
To satisfy state law, basically.
Right. Because we're not in any imminent danger of someone coming through auditing this and bringing us in front of the Texas Supreme Court or something.
For sure not. That's a good point. That we're self-reporting our own failure and we're not at risk of
Well,
any
in 6
punitive
months
action.
Is March,
Right.
right? So, I mean,
2 months away.
2 months away, so if it needs to come up again and we change how we're seated, then we can do it then. It'll take that long to come before city council again.
So Julie was an 8th person?
They used to sit up here, and then she was told she had to sit over here, she couldn't sit here. But then Leslie did used to sit at the table.
Were there
And-
7 or were there 8?
And I can't remember, I see, and Julie started as well, and I was basically the liaison over there.
Right. The city liaison can be someone other than myself, and the shelter representative could be someone other than myself. It could be one of my subordinates. It could be.
And you were the city representative that sat down there, and we still had the 7 up here. We had a city representative, a shelter representative, and 7 members up here back when I was here in the past. That's how it was.
And y'all are aware that we've brought a lot of things before you in the last year and a half or so that are not new laws, but we're becoming compliant now. So I think this is one of many that the more we go back and reread, the law says this. Has the law changed? In some cases, perhaps, but I'm someone, my inherent self is, I believe there's safety in the rules, that if the policy says this, if the policy is unpopular, it's unpopular, but my staff is protected because they carried out the policy. And so I think that there's a lot of good discussion that's come from each of these 7 individuals serving on the committee over the last year. But now that we know we're out of compliance, I think we do want to defer to the council's action to go ahead and the city attorney and city clerk are ready to recommend to the council appointments that or them taking the action to bring it into compliance. The Water Advisory Board is another one. The water director is stated by state law that she is a member of the committee, and it's pretty clearly defined in that way that she is a voting member, but she's often at the podium presenting to her own committee that she serves on. It's these specialized things that are mandated by state law, very similarly. So no action for the committee, but now we all know.
Follow-up administrative issues, consider meeting dates for 2019.
So kind of getting our new normal, catching our rhythm, it seems like over the 2018 calendar year, we met about quarterly, right? And so I would recommend that we meet the month after the quarter ends. So for the December 31st quarter, we just met today. For the March quarter end, we would meet in April. And so what's proposed in y'all's background is that we meet January 17th, that just happened, April 18th, July 18th, and October 17th. Those are third Thursdays. That's 4 times a year, so about quarterly, right? And meets the state requirement, which is 3 times a year. Then we can meet more frequently if we want. We can have our visitation at the shelter if we want. But to better communicate to the public and, reserving this room, deploying all the resources that it takes to have a meeting, we can just say, let's plan to meet those 4 dates.
Excuse me.
So that would be something before y'all for action today, if you so choose.
I move adoption of that schedule.
A second.
Aye.
Opposed? Third Thursday after the end of the quarter. Okay.
Those dates again for folks listening at home: April 18th, July 18th, October 17th.
Hopefully, at least once a quarter, we'll do a visitation to the shelter.
Yes.
Okay.
That'll be in the new bylaws. And I'm so sorry to go back. The bylaws, we've recommended approval of the document redrafted. It will go to council for ratification. And then once I have a clean copy, I'll get it out to each of y'all.
Anybody else have anything to discuss? Adjourned.